Across the globe, the fight for women's rights remains a very relevant one. Gender-based violence, the lack of female representation in political roles, the lack of reproductive rights, and the gender pay gap are all realities of today's society. And when it comes to femicide, sexual assault, and many other levels of violence against women, so much more needs to shift. But before we find out what the European Union is working on in pursuit of a safer and more equal society, let's see what Malta's youth think. Do you think men and women are being treated equally?
I don't think so, no. I think we've made a lot of improvements, but I still think there's a long way to go. I think that women are spoken about as a minority, so we use minority language and it's holding us back.
In Malta, no. From where I come from in England, it's very equal compared to here.
In places like, I don't know, the workplace, I once saw this statistic that said, like, globally, there are more CEOs with the name David than there are CEOs who are women.
I think we are, for the first time ever, getting really close.
Iva ta' ħafna aħjar mill kif kienet qabel żgur.
Mhux 100% ugwali, imma minn ħafna progress naħseb as a society, especially in terms of wages and job opportunities, education opportunities. Għatfadal, imma I think we're doing quite good.
It seems that there's quite a consensus here. The fight for women's rights towards equality has come a very long way, but there's still a long way to go. We're here at the European Parliament to find out what is being done to ensure equal rights and opportunities for women out there.
Well, the situation is pretty dire in the EU, as it is everywhere in the world. About 1 in 3 women in Europe over the age of 15 has experienced some sort of violence in their life, which is a horrific statistic, and we have to keep in mind that those statistics are likely lower than they should be because this type of crime tends to be underreported. So, the situation is probably worse than the numbers show. When we're talking about violence against women, the pinnacle of Parliament's achievements would be the directive on combating violence against women and girls, which is literally at the final steps of the process. It's going to be voted, finalized before the end of the term. The negotiations with the member states were long and difficult, but Parliament managed earlier this year to conclude the negotiations in a way that is more or less satisfactory. Of course, there is more that could have been achieved. It wasn't possible, unfortunately. But it's important to keep in mind that this is the first EU-level legislation that we have of this kind, protecting women and girls from violence. So the legislative work in Parliament never stops. We are at the moment discussing a revision of the Victims' Rights Directive, which looks into the type of care and treatment victims should get, the kind of training professionals should get, how the authorities should be treating victims of violence. The Directive on Human Trafficking has also been revised, which of course protects primarily women from the awful, awful crime of human trafficking.
What is the European Union currently working on to ensure equal rights for all women residing within EU member states?
We have already done quite a bit of work on that. Of course, again, the work continues. MEPs continue pushing for progress on these topics. But in this term, we actually managed to secure 2 very important pieces of legislation. One is on pay transparency. As we all know, the pay gap between the genders is prevalent across the board. I think it averages about 13% across the EU. And at least with the pay transparency rules, we are ensuring that people can do something about it, which is a very, very important thing, empowering people to actually fight for their rights, on the one hand. On the other, we also adopted earlier in this legislative term rules on representation, gender representation in corporate boards. That means that big companies will have to include women at an adequate rate in their top-level decision-making, which of course will bring an incremental change in how things are run and the culture that exists in certain work environments. We will have to see, I think, how the new legislation is implemented, how the new legislation actually changes people's lives on a practical level, and of course, how the member states decide to enforce the rules. Those rules are on the directive to combat violence against women and girls, and of course the European Union's accession to the Istanbul Convention on the same topic. This is going to take a while to see, but I think the way this goes is going to determine how things will evolve in the future, and it will basically allow people to see what the next steps should be. It's a very recent decision on both of those topics. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see.